Why is the heir to the English throne called the Prince of Wales? Because 700 years ago, England took the title from a man it had just killed. His name was Llywelyn ap Griffith, and in 1282 an English king had his head carried to London and set on the tower, crowned with ivy. The title survived him. The country it named did not get it back. That is the end of the story. It takes 4,000 years to arrive there, and the country that comes out the other side is still here, still speaking its own language, still arguing about that title. So go back to the beginning, and the beginning is a rock. In the Preseli Hills of West Wales there is an outcrop called Carn Gwydog. Around 3,000 years before Christ, people went up there and levered slabs of spotted dolerite off the rock face. Then they moved them 140 miles east, across rivers and hills, to a chalk plain in what is now Wiltshire. Those stones are still standing. They are the bluestones at the centre of Stonehenge, the most famous monument in Britain, and the oldest part of it did not come from Britain's most famous plain. It came from a Welsh hillside. Nobody has ever fully explained why, but it tells you something about this corner of the island before anyone had thought of a border. People here were organised enough and determined enough to drag mountains across a country. On Anglesey, they left Bryn Celli Ddu, a passage tomb built so that the sunrise on the longest day of the year runs straight down it. Then Rome came. The Roman army landed in Britain in AD 43 and took the southeast quickly. The west took 30 years. The Silures and the Ordovices fought them from about AD 48 until roughly AD 78, and Rome held what it took with soldiers. Isca at Caerleon was one of only 3 permanent legionary fortresses in the whole of Roman Britain. But they did not come only to garrison it. In the hills of Carmarthenshire, at Dolau Cothi, they cut open-cast workings and drove tunnels into the rock for gold. It is the only Roman gold mine known anywhere in Britain, and in the southeast they built a town, Caerwent, the capital of the Silures, run by a council of local men under Roman law. Its walls are still standing, over a mile of them, 25 feet high in places, the best preserved Roman town walls in Britain. When the legions went in the early 5th century, the people they left behind were Christian, and they were speaking a Brittonic language that would become Welsh. They produced saints, and Dewi Sant, a 6th century monk, is still the patron saint of the country. And then came the people who would give the country its English name. The Anglo-Saxons who moved into the east of the island had a word for the people already living there, wheelers. It meant foreigners, strangers. So the English name for this country is a name given by newcomers to the island's older inhabitants, and it means the people who do not belong here. The Welsh had their own word, and they still use it. Cymru. It comes from a Brittonic word meaning fellow countrymen. Compatriots. One name says strangers, the other says our own people. They describe the same mountains. In the 8th century, one of those newcomers drew the argument on the ground. Offa was king of Mercia, the great Midland kingdom of Anglo-Saxon England, and somewhere in the late 700s his people cut an earthwork along the western edge of his territory, a bank with a ditch on the Welsh side. About 82 miles of it still survives, which makes Offa's Dyke the longest ancient monument in Britain. And the border between England and Wales today, the line on every map, still runs close to the line Offa's men dug 1,200 years ago. A boundary marked in earth 7 centuries before anyone wrote it into law. Behind that line, the Welsh were doing something the rest of the island was not. Around the 940s, a king called Hywel, remembered as Hywel Dda, Hywel the Good, gathered men at Whitland and had the customary law of the Welsh written down. What they produced was not English law, and it was not Roman law. It was built on compensation rather than punishment. Kill a man, and the system asks what his life is worth to his kin and makes you pay it. It gave a wife who left a marriage a claim on property, at a time when that was not the assumption elsewhere. One law, for the Welsh, across a country that had never been ruled by one man. And it held for 600 years. Cyfraith Hywel, the law of Hywel, was still the law of Wales when Henry VIII abolished it. Remember that, because it comes back at the end. Because one law is not one country. In its entire history, Wales was ruled by a single native king for about 8 years. His name was Griffith ap Llywelyn. By 1055 he had beaten, married or outlived every rival prince in the country, and for the first and only time the whole of Wales answered to one man. He raided deep into England. He was strong enough that the English earls had to take him seriously. In 1063, Harold Godwinson came at him hard, and Griffith's own men killed him and sent his head to Harold. 8 years. That is the whole of United Native Wales. Everything that happens next happens to a country that is many countries, and that is the reason. 4 years after Griffith died, the Normans arrived in England, and they did not stop at Offa's Dyke. William gave his hardest men the border and told them to take what they could hold. What they carved out became the March, a belt of private lordships where the lords held their land by conquest, ran their own courts, and answered to the king for very little. So the map splits in two, and it stays split for 450 years. Norman lords in the south and the east, Welsh princes in the mountains of the north and the west. In South Pembrokeshire, they settled so thoroughly that a language line formed across the county, the Landscare. They called the southern half Little England beyond Wales, and you can still hear that border in the place names today. The princes who survived that pressure did it from one place, Gwynedd, behind the mountains of Snowdonia, where an army coming from the east has to fight uphill through passes for every mile. In the early 13th century, Llywelyn the Great pulled the other Welsh rulers under Gwyned's leadership. He did not make himself King of Wales. He made himself the prince the others answered to, and he built the structure his grandson would inherit. That grandson was Llywelyn ap Griffith, and in September 1267 at Montgomery he got something no Welshman had ever been given. Henry III of England signed a treaty recognizing him as Prince of Wales, with the other Welsh rulers owing homage to him. Not a rebel, not a troublesome lord, a prince acknowledged by the English crown. It is the only time in history that an English king recognized a Welshman in that title. 15 years later, a different king was on the English throne, and Edward I did not intend to share an island. The trouble started over homage. Llywelyn refused to come and kneel. Edward took that as the excuse he needed, and in 1277 he came west with an army bigger than anything Wales had seen, and a fleet to cut Gwynedd off from Anglesey, which is where Gwynedd grew its grain. He did not have to win a great battle. He starved the mountains. Llywelyn submitted, kept the title, and lost almost everything else. Then in 1282, his brother Davies started a rising, and the whole country went up with him, and this time Edward came to finish it. On the 11th of December 1282, near a village called Cilmeri, in the valley of the River Aberfan in mid-Wales, Llywelyn ap Griffith was away from the main body of his army with a small escort. English forces found him there. He was cut down in a skirmish in winter, and there is a reasonable chance the man who killed him did not know who he was until afterwards. His head was cut off and carried to London. It was set on the tower, and it was crowned with ivy. That was not an accident of cruelty. There was an old prophecy among the Welsh that one day a prince of theirs would be crowned in London. The ivy was the answer to it. Davies held out through the winter and into the summer. He was taken in 1283, tried at Shrewsbury, and executed. With him, the native principality of Wales ended. It has never come back. Edward then did something that most conquerors do not bother to do. He made it permanent in stone. He ringed the north of Wales with castles. Flint and Rhuddlan from the First War, then Conwy, Carmarthen, Harlech, and finally Beaumaris on Anglesey. They went up in a single generation under a master mason from Savoy called James of St. George, and they cost the English crown something in the order of £80,000 in the money of the 1280s, which was a staggering sum. Carmarthen was the statement. Its walls are built in bands of different coloured stone, and that is not decoration. It echoes the walls of Constantinople, the imperial capital, and it casts Edward as a Caesar and Wales as a province. Beside each castle, he planted a walled town and filled it with English settlers who got trading privileges the Welsh did not. They are still standing today, All four of the Great Ones have been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1986, and they are the reason North Wales looks the way it does from the air. They were not built to defend a coast, they were built to hold down a country. Back in the 1280s, the law followed the stone. In 1284, the Statute of Rhuddlan annexed the principality to the English crown, cut it into counties on the English pattern, and imposed English criminal law. Welsh law survived in civil matters, but the shape of the country changed. The counties that statute drew lasted until 1974, and in February 1301, at a parliament in Lincoln, Edward I created his 16-year-old son, Prince of Wales. The boy had been born at Carmarthen, inside the new castle, in 1284. Every heir to the English and then the British throne since has carried that title. So that is the answer to the question this started with. The heir to the English throne is called the Prince of Wales because an English king took the title off a dead Welshman and gave it to his own son. There is a famous story attached to it. Edward promising the Welsh a prince born in Wales who spoke no word of English, then holding up his baby son. It is a good story, and it is almost certainly not true. It first appears in print in 1584, nearly 300 years later, in a history by David Powell, and the English royal family of 1301 spoke French. If you are finding this worth your time, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making them. And the country is only halfway through its story. For 100 years after the conquest, Wales was a governed place. Then in September 1400, a middle-aged landowner in the northeast fell out with an English neighbour over a piece of land, could get no justice for it, and his followers proclaimed him Prince of Wales. His name was Owain Glyndwr, and what started as a local quarrel became the last time Wales acted as an independent state. Within 4 years he held most of the country. Harlech and Aberystwyth fell to him. And in 1404 he did something no Welsh rebel had done. He called a parliament at Machynlleth and had himself crowned there in front of envoys from France, Spain and Scotland. That is a state behaving like a state. Foreign recognition, a parliament, a crown. In 1406 he went further. In a letter sent to Charles VI of France from Penal, he set out what an independent Wales would look like. An independent Welsh church answering to no English archbishop, and 2 universities, one in the north and one in the south, for a country that had never had one. None of it happened. Henry IV's son, the future Henry V, ground the rising down. The French help came and went. The castles were retaken. Parliament passed penal laws against the Welsh, barring them from holding office, from carrying arms in towns, from buying land in England or in the English boroughs. And Owain Glyndwr was never captured. He was never betrayed in a country where betrayal had ended every previous Welsh leader. He was offered a royal pardon twice and refused it both times. Around 1415, he simply disappears from the record and nobody has ever found his grave. 120 years later, the argument was settled with a pen. Henry VIII had a Welsh grandfather and no patience for a border full of private jurisdictions where criminals could step across a lordship line and vanish. So the laws in Wales Acts of 1536 and 1543 did what 4 centuries of fighting had not. They abolished the Marcher lordships. They annexed Wales to England outright. They shired the entire country into counties, fixed the border that is still on the map today, and for the first time sent Welsh members to the Parliament at Westminster. And they abolished Cyfrith Hawl, the law that had defined the Welsh for 600 years. Then there is the clause that matters most. English was made the only language of the courts and of public office. Anyone who wanted to hold office in Wales had to use English to do it. At that point, the overwhelming majority of people in Wales spoke no English at all. So the language of almost everyone in the country became a bar to running any part of it. Everything that happens in the next 400 years comes out of that sentence. And then the same Tudor state, for its own reasons, did the one thing that saved the language it had just demoted. In 1563, an act ordered that the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer be translated into Welsh. Not out of affection, the government was more frightened of Welsh Catholicism than it was of the Welsh language, and it wanted the Reformed faith to reach people in words they actually understood. The work fell to a clergyman from the Conwy Valley called William Morgan, and in 1588 his complete Welsh Bible was finished. A copy went into every parish church in Wales. That is the hinge of the whole story. Across Europe, languages without a state behind them were dying in this era. Welsh got something almost none of them got. A dignified, standardized written form read aloud every week in every parish to a population that could not read but could listen. Morgan's Welsh became the standard the language has been measured against ever since. The state banned Welsh from the courtroom and put it in the pulpit, and the pulpit won. There is one more thing the Tudors did with Wales, and it is stranger. There was a legend, already 4 centuries old by then, that a Welsh prince called Madoc had sailed west across the Atlantic in 1170 and reached America. In 1580, John Dee, Elizabeth I's astrologer, used that legend as legal argument. If a Welshman got to North America first, and the Tudors were a Welsh dynasty, then the English crown had a prior claim to the continent. The story grew. For 2 centuries people looked for Welsh-speaking Indians and settled on the Mandan people of the upper Missouri. And it was a Welshman who ended it. John Evans went out to find them, wintered with the Mandan in 1796 and 1797, learned what he needed to know, and reported that there was no such people as the Welsh Indians. In the 18th century, something happened to Wales that had nothing to do with kings. A clergyman called Griffith Jones set up schools that moved. They arrived in a parish, taught people to read Welsh over a few months, usually in winter when farm work was slack, and moved on. By his death in 1761, those circulating schools had taught something like 200,000 people to read, in a country of about 450,000. That made Wales one of the most literate countries in Europe, and it was literate in Welsh, in Morgan's Welsh, because the book they learned on was the Bible. The religious revival that followed built Chapel Wales, and Chapel Wales ran the culture of the country for the next 200 years. Then the ground itself changed the country again. Along the northern rim of the South Wales coalfield, there was iron ore, limestone and coal sitting almost on top of each other. Merthyr Tydfil became the iron capital of the world and the largest town in Wales, bigger than Cardiff and Swansea. And on the 21st of February 1804, on the tram road out of Penderyn, an engineer called Richard Trevithick ran a steam locomotive along rails, hauling 10 tons of iron and 70 men, for nearly 10 miles. That is the first railway journey in the history of the world, and it happened in Merthyr, 21 years before Stockton and Darlington. By the census of 1851, Wales became the first country anywhere with more of its people working in industry than in agriculture. The first industrial nation, not Britain. Wales, it came at a price the people paying it noticed. In 1831, the workers of Merthyr took the town and held it for the best part of a week against soldiers. During that rising, a flag soaked in the blood of a slaughtered calf was raised over the crowd, and that is the first recorded raising of the red flag as a banner of revolt anywhere in Britain. A young miner called Richard Lewis, known as Dick Penderyn, was hanged at Cardiff that August for wounding a soldier with a bayonet. The evidence was thin at the time, and years later another man was reported to have confessed to it. He is remembered as the first Welsh working-class martyr. 8 years later at Newport, soldiers firing from the Westgate Hotel killed about 22 Chartists demanding the vote. It was the last large-scale armed rising in Britain, and in 1847 the government came for the language. 3 English commissioners who spoke no Welsh were sent to report on education in Wales. Their report blamed the Welsh language for immorality, ignorance and backwardness. It is remembered in Welsh as Bradwy Llyfrau Gleision, the treachery of the Blue Books. Out of that era comes the Welsh knot, a piece of wood on a cord hung round the neck of a child caught speaking Welsh in school, passed to the next child caught, and whoever wore it at the end of the day was beaten. It is worth being precise about this, because it matters. Punishing Welsh was never official government policy. It was practice in schools, carried out by teachers, and often supported by Welsh parents who had read what the Blue Book said and concluded that English was their children's way out. That is the harder version of the story, and it is the true one. A generation was taught that its own language was a thing to be ashamed of, and some of that teaching was done by its own people. Some decided the answer was to leave. On the 28th of July 1865, a tea clipper called the Mimosa landed 153 Welsh settlers on the coast of Chubut in Argentina. The idea was a Wales beyond the reach of English law, English landlords and English schools, where the language would simply be the language. It nearly starved in the first year. It survived. And Welsh is still spoken in Gaiman and Trelew today by somewhere between 1,500 and 5,000 people, 8,000 miles from Snowdonia. Back home and back a lifetime, the coal had been rewriting where Welsh people lived. In 1800, there were about 1,500 miners in Wales. By 1913, there were 250,000. The South Wales coalfield was cutting close to 61 million tonnes a year, and Cardiff was the largest coal-exporting port on earth. Welsh steam coal drove the Royal Navy and half the merchant fleets in the world. The price of coal was set in a building in Cardiff docks. And the people came, into narrow valleys with room for one road, one river, and a terrace of houses on each side, from rural Wales and from England and from Italy and Spain. That is why 2/3 of the population of Wales still lives on the footprint of a coalfield that barely operates anymore. The map of modern Wales was drawn by where the seams ran. The bill came due on the 14th of October 1913. An explosion tore through the Universal Colliery at Senghenydd in the Aber Valley. 440 men and boys died, including one of the rescuers. It is still the worst mining disaster in British history. The company was fined. The fine worked out at a little over £1 per life. 3 years later, a Welsh-speaking solicitor from Llywelyn Ddu was running the British Empire's war. David Lloyd George became Prime Minister in 1916, the only Welsh speaker ever to hold the office. By the middle of the 20th century, the country had a symbol older than almost any other in Europe, and no official flag to put it on. The red dragon appears as the emblem of the Britons in a text written around the year 828, and Geoffrey of Monmouth later attached it to Merlin, and a prophecy of a red dragon beating a white one. The prophecy is legend. The 828 text is record. And the flag itself, the one flown everywhere in Wales today, was only made official in 1959. One of the oldest national symbols on earth, on one of the youngest national flags. 3 years after that, a writer called Saunders Lewis gave a radio lecture called Tynged Iaith, the fate of the language. He said plainly that Welsh would die in the next century unless people were willing to break the law to save it. Cymdeithas Iaith, the Welsh Language Society, formed out of it and started painting out English-only road signs and refusing to pay for English-only licenses. And then, while that argument was starting, Liverpool drowned a village. Liverpool Corporation wanted a reservoir, and it took an Act of Parliament to get one, which meant it did not need the consent of any Welsh authority. The valley chosen was Tryweryn, and the village in it was Capel, one of the last entirely Welsh-speaking communities of its kind. A school, a chapel, a post office, farms. 35 of Wales's 36 members of Parliament voted against the bill. It passed anyway. Capel went under the water in 1965. 2 words appeared on a ruined wall near Aberystwyth. Coffiwch Tryweryn. Remember Tryweryn. They are still repainted there today, and the point they made was simple. On something that mattered this much, Welsh votes could not stop it. In July 1966, Gwynfor Evans won Carmarthen, and Plaid Cymru had a seat in Parliament for the first time. Liverpool formally apologised for Tryweryn in 2005. 3 months after that election, the coal came back for its last account. Above the village of Aberfan on the mountain stood 7 tips of colliery waste. Tip number 7 had been built over a stream. People in the village had complained about it. There had been slides before. On the morning of the 21st of October 1966, after weeks of rain, Tip 7 moved. A wave of saturated black waste came down the mountainside and into the village. It hit Pantglas Junior School a few minutes after the register had been taken, on the last morning before half-term. 144 people were killed. 116 of them were children, most of them between 7 and 10 years old. Almost a whole generation of one village, in one morning. The tribunal that followed was blunt in a way official reports rarely are. It placed the blame entirely on the National Coal Board and on a failure to act on warnings that had been given for years. Nobody was prosecuted, nobody was demoted, and the Coal Board refused to pay for removing the tips that still stood above the village. So the Disaster Fund, the money the public had raised for the bereaved, was pressed into paying £150,000 to have them taken away. It was paid back in 1997, 30 years later, without interest. The Charity Commission has since called the original deed unquestionably unlawful. The politics that came out of those years moved slowly, and it lost first. In 1979, Wales was offered an assembly of its own and rejected it by roughly 4-1. 3 years later, Gwynfor Evans, then in his late 60s, announced he would fast until death unless the government honoured its promise of a Welsh-language television channel. The government gave way, and S4C launched in 1982. The Welsh Language Acts of 1967 and 1993 brought Welsh back into the courts and into public administration, undoing by degrees what 1536 had done. And on the 18th of September 1997, Wales was asked again. It said yes by 6,721 votes out of more than 1 million cast. 50.3% against 49.7%. A margin the size of a small town. The first Welsh Parliament since Owain Glyndwr called one at Machynlleth in 1404 opened in Cardiff Bay in 1999. Welsh was given official status in Wales in 2011. In 2020, the institution took the name it has now, the Senedd. And the language the whole story has been about? At the 2021 census, 538,300 people in Wales said they could speak Welsh, 17.8%. That is the lowest share any census has ever recorded. So the story does not end in triumph, and it would be dishonest to pretend it does. A country whose name in English means strangers has been conquered, annexed, shired, and told its own language was a barrier to holding office in its own land. It lost its last prince in a winter skirmish in 1282, and it has never had another one of its own. And it is still here. It still has the law's memory, the Bible's language, the dragon that predates the flag, a parliament won by 6,000 votes and 500,000 people speaking a language that most of Europe's stateless tongues did not manage to keep. That is how Wales was made. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. There is a lot more of this on the channel. And tell me in the comments which country you want next.